The war in Ukraine is coming full circle, at least when it comes to the weather. Back in February 2022, as Russia prepared for the invasion to begin, parts of the Ukrainian landscape were dotted in white. Fast forward to today, and while we might have different British prime ministers and new fashion choices, we are once again seeing snow fall in Ukraine. Accordingly, much of the public discourse surrounding the war has turned to how winter will affect things. And the conventional wisdom is that it will be bad for Ukraine and good for Russia. The central logic is that Ukraine has been on the offensive since September, first retaking outlying regions in the north, before forcing Russia to retreat from Kherson City. As we have discussed before, until that momentum dies down, Ukraine has little incentive to make concessions to Russia. However, conventional wisdom says that winter creates a bunch of logistical problems for continuing the offensives, and thus may be the momentum killer that Ukraine fears. And this logic is spot on. Weather changes likely will impede some of Ukraine's momentum. But that does not mean that winter is Ukraine's enemy. Rather, winter changes many other facets of the war, and some may allow Ukraine to end up on top. We will cover many of the key ones here today, including rotation and shelter, supply logistics, and perhaps Ukraine's greatest advantage, military discipline. But before delving deep into winter's other effects, it is worth making two broader points about what war really is. Understanding these 2 points is critical for deciphering how anything affects military confrontations, cold weather or otherwise. First is recognizing that war is a political decision. What happens on the battlefield is ultimately a series of messages directed to and from the battling countries' capitals. Kyiv is trying to send the signal to Moscow that Russian forces are better off retreating to the original borders. Meanwhile, Moscow is trying to send the signal to Kyiv that Ukrainian forces are better off letting Russia complete the annexation of occupied territories. Very few wars end with one side's complete military defeat, where that side cannot effectively fight any further. Rather, wars tend to continue until one side decides that prolonging the battle is no longer worthwhile, as compared to what the other side's terms of settlement look like. This framework tells us that we should not just analyze how winter affects combat logistics. We must also consider the broader political implications of the new phase. Second, always remember that winning a war versus losing a war is a zero-sum game. If we think of the invasion of Ukraine as a territorial battle, whatever additional portion Ukraine protects has an equivalent loss for Russia, and whatever additional portion Russia wins has an equivalent loss for Ukraine. That means we should care less about what makes Ukraine weaker or stronger in an absolute sense, and instead focus on whether something makes Ukraine weaker or stronger relative to Russia. That being said, war is negative-sum overall due to the death and destruction it brings. The type and extent of that death and destruction will change as a function of the weather, which is something to keep in mind as we discuss the rest of the issues. With those framing points out of the way, let's begin by more thoroughly dissecting the conventional wisdom of how winter ought to benefit Russia. Regarding the situation on the ground, the theory here is that winter is cold and wet, forcing soldiers to rethink their priorities and generally limiting movement. Given that Ukraine has been on the offensive in recent months, winter essentially gives Russia a timeout. This would benefit Moscow for two reasons. First, it would give Russian troops on the front lines time to fortify their positions. There is a useful comparison here to Luhansk and Donetsk, two regions of Ukraine that Russia has de facto controlled since 2014. One of the main reasons Ukraine has not tried to target them is because of the trenches and fortifications established there. rather than engage in a very expensive battle reminiscent of World War I. Ukraine has gone for the lower-hanging fruit first. Presumably, Russia will spend the slower winter months expanding those positions in the north. We also know that after Russia retreated from Kherson, fortifying the southern bank of the Dnipro River has been a major priority for it. More time means more strength there, too. Finally, as we have discussed before, the obvious next path for Ukraine is to avoid the river, go down Zaporizhia, and cut the Crimean land bridge in half. Again, more time would give Russia the ability to establish defensive positions to counteract that. The other reason a timeout for winter would help Russia is its mobilization efforts. Putin first announced the conscription of 300,000 soldiers, though in practice probably more like 500,000 soldiers, on September 21st. The question immediately turned to whether Russia would treat the call-ups as cannon fodder to shore up Kherson and the north, or actually spend time to train them to be an effective fighting force. The answer, it turns out, appears to be some of both. Winter ostensibly will help Russia with the training portion, giving instructors the time to turn human speed bumps that they first placed in position into an actual military threat. Then there is the always fun political situation in Europe. Ukraine needs Western support to counteract Russia's population and economic advantages. The winter theory here is that Europeans, and particularly Germans, will get fed up with being cold and force Ukraine back to the bargaining table with Russia. All of these points have elements of truth to them. However, focusing on this narrative misses the bigger picture. As a starting point, it is a misperception that winter implies a frozen conflict, both figuratively and literally. This is the idea that winter causes both sides to take the time out we've been talking about, deal with whatever the cold weather brings, and restart the real fight once the thaw begins. I suspect that this misperception arises from various historical imagery of winter and war, whether we are going back to Valley Forge and the American Revolution, Napoleon's invasion of Russia, Germany's invasion of Russia, or the Battle of the Bulge. The extreme interpretation of this is obviously untrue. The fact that the Battle of the Bulge was a battle immediately underscores that point. Then there is a thing actually called the Winter War, which was both just in winter and resulted in almost 200,000 dead. But to whatever degree winter slows or outright halts direct military confrontations, this belief still fundamentally misunderstands what war truly is. On the pure military side of things, the point of a war is to exert costly effort to eliminate the other side. If you close your eyes for a second and paint a mental picture of this, you probably imagine two militaries shooting at each other. Costs? Check. Moving one side toward elimination? Check. Now think about what winter does. Movement is still possible. It is just more difficult. Snow might cut the speed of infantry in half, for example. In wooded operation zones, the trees have become barren, making it easier for you to aim your crosshairs at oncoming attackers. But despite those reservations, offensive operations remain possible. As a result, you can't just leave the front lines unguarded. If you do, the other side can just ignore the weather, stroll on in, and make good progress. In turn, you end up having two sides lined up in the cold being miserable, and if they are not careful, they will succumb to the temperature, if not enemy fire. Costs? Check. Moving toward one side's elimination? Check, assuming that the other side is better at surviving the winter. In any case, it is better to think of the cold as a substitute for traditional armed conflict, rather than a timeout. That changes the metrics for what defines a successful army. Instead of raw capacity for violence, the game pivots more heavily to logistics, which we will get to in a moment. But the key point here is that there will still be progress in the war. It's just a different pathway to get to that progress. There is also the fact that winter can actually facilitate military operations. Longtime viewers will remember this as the Rasputitsa problem, the soupy mud that forms during rainy seasons and makes navigation more difficult for all types of vehicles. Since the invention of the road, it has been a problem before and after winter, and it can also come up during winter if conditions are mild. When temperatures range 5 degrees above or below freezing, or 10 degrees in my beloved Freedom units, snow will fall, then melt, and then generally create wet conditions that tanks and other vehicles can get stuck in. But it is not just a problem for those motor vehicles. It can also give infantry headaches. Wet clothes are a ticket to frostbite and hypothermia. The average high and low in January in Kherson falls within this range. Luhansk is a little colder, but it's a similar story. For perspective, Moscow off-screen is notably colder than that. Of course, averages are just that. Averages. Cold snaps can hit, and if they persist, then we transition to drier conditions, even if the snow is still on the ground. The mud firms up, allowing tanks to traverse land without much difficulty. Wet snow becomes firm, frozen snow. Yes, it will still slow down infantry. And yes, they will still have more tasks to work on. But as long as the soldiers have enough clothing, they are not at the same risk as under the wet conditions. Remember, much of Ukraine's gains up north came from lightning strikes, injecting tanks into combat at speeds that left Russia with no time to prepare. The point here is that peak winter could still facilitate that tactic, depending on how cold it gets. Meanwhile, wet winters may help Ukraine on a different dimension instead. During the fall, as we have discussed before, Ukraine had a superior ability to transport troops along the front lines. This gave them a superior ratio advantage for the northern assault. Mud would seem to eliminate that possibility. But remember, winning is zero-sum. Ukraine may have mud problems, but so too does Russia. Unless Ukraine somehow has more mud on its side, then those effects might wash out, and Ukraine can still employ the tactic. After all, it's a race. You don't need to set the world record. You just need to beat the other side's time. That's it. Now let's turn to the winter problems that frontline soldiers face, beginning with rotation. Rotation is a standard necessity regardless of the season. Soldiers need time away to avoid combat fatigue, and literal fatigue from sleep deprivation. It's also a good idea to come home every now and then to remember what it is that you're fighting for. Winter only increases the need for rotation. Psychologically, the cold will sap morale. Physically, it will cause frostbite. Heading off the front lines and back into the warmth of the indoors will keep your soldiers in fighting shape. They can grab a cup of warm tea or coffee and then head back out to the front. Within this war, we have already seen what happens if you do not rotate. In fact, it hindered Russia in the early phase of the invasion. Under the false belief that Ukrainians would not have the political will to fight, Moscow sent just 200,000 troops into Ukraine. When Ukrainians pushed back, Russia found itself with insufficient forces to make regular rotations. The front line suffered, allowing Ukraine to inflict heavy casualties. There is a big question mark whether Russia's September mobilization rectified the problem, especially now that winter will require more frequent cycling. But regardless, there are two critical advantages that Ukraine has here. First, they have the home field advantage. The western side of the front lines tends to be in better shape than the eastern side. After all, most of the fighting has taken place east of the current line of control. Ironically, Russia destroyed a fair bit of what they would now want to use for shelter to eliminate Ukraine's cover as Ukraine retreated. And because this is Ukraine, the people living on either side of the front lines will tend to be more friendly to Ukrainians. All this is to say that the critical shelters that both sides need for resting troops are going to be better for Ukraine. The second advantage goes back to the war's momentum. As long as Ukrainian soldiers stay on the offensive, rotations are less relevant for them. That is because the troops starting the offensive can be kept warm until it is time to go, and then selectively target the places where the defending troops are struggling the most. The attackers eventually will need to rotate once put into combat, of course. They just get the benefit of being 100% fresh at the start. Now let's pivot to supply logistics. Winter increases the need for a ton of gear. This begins with clothing. If you have ever lived in a cold weather climate, then you know just how much of a difference a layer or two of thermals makes. In winter, I would rather be dressed like this and have antiquated military equipment than be dressed like this and have the most modern technology otherwise. The better dressed side can just wait for the poorly dressed side to freeze to death. Russia was struggling to issue basic uniforms a few months ago, and new recruits were being told to bring their own equipment. That makes you wonder how they could handle more advanced winter needs. The silver lining for Russia is that Moscow has disproportionately mobilized soldiers from the east, so they should have more experience at handling the cold. But there is a big difference between living in a frozen climate and living outdoors in a frozen climate. Moving on, they will also need heaters to generate warmth. They will need more batteries to run everything. And to make matters worse, batteries are less effective in the cold, so they will need even more batteries. They will need more food, especially hot food, because humans burn more calories in the cold to stay warm. They will need more fuel, because vehicle engines will be kept running to keep occupants from freezing, and because of the more frequent rotations, and because they need to transport all of this stuff to the front. Other than the fuel needs, all of these are going to be more difficult for Russia because of the sanctions and lack of international contributions. And speaking of transport, this is going to bring renewed focus on the Crimean Bridge. It is still not exactly clear what is happening with it, in part because permanent cloud cover has prevented satellites from providing updates. Putin made a visit there on December 5th, and seemed to indicate that the road bridge they were walking on is mostly fixed, though clearly the rail bridge behind them still shows significant damage. Regardless, the bridge is a clear target for a second attack, especially given the quantity of equipment that Russian troops will need to survive the winter. To make matters worse for Moscow, the way they fixed the bridge was to tug in prefabricated sections of the bridge by boat, and then raise them with cranes, similar to how the bridge was constructed in the first place. The problem here is that the Kerch Strait freezes in winter. That means if Ukraine were to target the bridge now, Russia might not have such a quick fix available. Another point of conversation during Putin's visit was the need to construct a highway along the land bridge. Consequently, even a slow-moving attack down Zaporizhia to cut the corridor in half might disproportionately benefit Ukraine. But I think the biggest Ukrainian advantage for the winter lies in its military discipline. Soldiers on the front lines are going to want to stay warm, but the actions they take to do so might backfire both for themselves and for their colleagues. The easiest way to get warm and dry your gear on the front lines is to light a fire. The problem there is that this will light you up like a Christmas tree for the opposing artillery. Now you and your friends are dead. So much for happy holidays. A more creative solution is to drink alcohol. Vodka makes you warm, right? And as a bonus, it might temporarily relieve the stress of being on the front lines. A couple problems there. The reason that hitting up the bar for a drink makes you feel warmer is because alcohol opens up your blood vessels, allowing more blood to reach your skin. But that warmth is immediately shared with Mother Nature, and your core temperature drops. The alleged solution will actually kill you more quickly. Oh, and you're also drunk. Good luck protecting yourself and your comrades if an attack begins. The easiest way to stay warm is to never get cold. But this creates a perverse incentive. Imagine that your commander tells you to go out on a scouting mission or do a perimeter patrol. You have two options: do it and get cold, or stay in and feign compliance. Keeping discipline under these circumstances is difficult because the individual does not internalize all of the consequences of their actions. Your fire, your drunkenness, and your missed patrol all directly hurt me. The end result is that each individual undisciplined behavior stacks up. What was good for each person incrementally ultimately makes everyone worse off. Political scientists call this type of situation a collective action problem, and the solutions to it are well known. One basic solution for a government is to change the preferences of the individual. If soldiers have patriotic feelings and internalize the success of the country as a whole, then they will be more willing to make the personal sacrifice. That's why Russia spends so much money on military parades, and why high-quality images of them are freely available online. But Ukrainian soldiers naturally have this given the context of the current war. They know what they are fighting for. Russian troops don't, no matter what their smiling faces at the parades appear to say. They question why they are there. Many are only in Ukraine because they had no real choice, and some are literal convicts that have been released to shore up manpower issues. World War II, this is not. Another basic solution is to implement rigorous oversight and punish violators. Again, Ukraine is advantaged here due to the gutting of Russia's officer ranks. To end, let's briefly discuss two other issues that ostensibly should hurt Ukraine, beginning with infrastructure bombing. Make no mistake, this is going to be the worst winter the average Ukrainian has ever experienced. Russia keeps hammering Ukrainian power installations and other utilities, sometimes leaving the country in the dark and forcing many to go to bed without heat. Yes, this is going to hurt, but it won't do much to end the war. Ukraine has demonstrated its resolve well before this phase of the conflict. Everyone knows it is happening and will continue to happen. It's not changing expectations. It's not going to change many minds or increase political pressure on Zelensky to concede territory to Russia. Destroying infrastructure will hamper Ukraine's general war effort, though, so it is not good for Ukraine. But it is also not likely to affect the war outcome in the short term. In the long term, the narrative that Russia is favored once the soldiers' training is complete is a bit misguided. Ukraine has the backing of just about all the world's major economies. That is more important if the war goes on without an obvious end. Finally, let's talk about Germany. The idea that winter will invariably change German minds and cause Western support to disappear is a fundamental misreading of the situation, and war negotiations more generally. It treats Germans like they are a silly group, incapable of processing how winters are cold, and not having gas during that time is bad. The fact that Germany began stockpiling gas almost immediately shows that this is not true. The fact that you can't find electrical appliances on store shelves because everyone is trying to switch also shows that this is not true. The real issue is that unresolved Germans have an incentive to act tough until they must actually start making sacrifices. Russia might believe that this is what we are observing and are calling Germany's bluff. And Russia might be right. But it is also possible that Germans truly are resolved, and over the winter, will finally have an opportunity to demonstrate that resolve. If so, Russia will have to reassess its chances. This would help end the war, but in Ukraine's favor. There is also the one slight problem that Nord Stream is mostly busted, so ending the conflict won't immediately revert the energy situation back to what it looked like in January 2022. In other words, Germany doesn't actually benefit that much by caving in. How else do you think winter will affect the war? Let me know in the comments. If you want to know more about the war, you will love my book that explains the causes of it. Check below for more information on that. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care. And congratulations to Sam Bankman-Fried, winner of the International Relations Misplay of the Week. All he had to do is get on a charter plane to a non-extradition country, and things might have been okay. Oops. One wonders if Putin will play things